Well, joining us now on our outdoor set is Harvard professor Randall Kennedy. He's been a frequent guest on Book TV and on C-SPAN, and his most recent book, which came out last year, which he's talking about down here in Miami, For Discrimination, Race, Affirmative Action, and the Law. Professor Kennedy, has affirmative action been successful in this country?
I think it's been very successful over the past several decades. It has helped with the desegregation of American life, particularly in higher education and in employment. And I think that it has done a very good job in a variety of ways. It has helped to rectify past injustice. It has helped to bring into important discussions people who had heretofore been excluded, and therefore enriched our public debate and our learning in various schools. So I think it has been a success, and that's certainly what I argue in my book.
Where'd you come up with the title, For Discrimination?
It was the last thing that was part of this project. I did not have a working title. The book had to be published. I needed a title. And actually, the person who came up with the title was my editor, Errol McDonald, at Pantheon Books. I had come up with a couple of titles. They were pretty flat. He came up with, he said, what about For Discrimination? Initially, I didn't like it, because usually when people use the word discrimination, it's a bad thing. But it grew on me, and I've come to like it.
Is there a stigma attached to affirmative action?
Yes. Affirmative action, like many social policies, has costs. And certainly one cost of affirmative action is the idea that its beneficiaries, or people who, even if they're not beneficiaries, if they're thought to be beneficiaries, I think many people think that, well, so-and-so is a beneficiary of affirmative action, they probably are a little less good than people who did not have affirmative action, because I mean, affirmative action means giving people, a helping hand, a boost. So if you needed a helping hand, if you needed a boost, that suggests that maybe you're not as good as others. So yes, there is a stigma cost.
Randall Kennedy, Harvard Law, is our guest for the next half hour or so. If you would like to call in and talk with him about some of the issues that we've started talking about, 202 is the area code, 585-3890 if you live in the East and Central time zones, 585-3891 for those of you out west. Go ahead and dial in and we'll get to your calls as quickly as possible. Professor Kennedy, are you a recipient of affirmative action?
Yes. I am an affirmative action baby. I was helped by affirmative action in terms of my education. One doesn't know for sure, but I feel virtually certain that affirmative action helped enable me to go to Yale Law School. I think that affirmative action likely helped me to secure a job at Harvard Law School. I was a very fine student. I've been very hardworking. I think that my record speaks for itself, and that I've been able to be a real contributor to legal academia. But have I been helped, like so many other African Americans over the past 30 years in elite institutions? Have I been helped by affirmative action? Yes.
When did affirmative action begin in this country?
Well, it all depends on how you define affirmative action. For instance, I mean, there's a way of saying that affirmative action has been part of American life since the Civil War. The nation's first federal civil rights statute, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, was vetoed by the President of the United States, Andrew Johnson, the successor to Abraham Lincoln. And Andrew Johnson vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1866 because he said it would give, quote, discriminating protection to African Americans. He thought that it was giving an illicit unjust helping hand to African Americans because it allowed African Americans to become citizens of the United States immediately. He thought that that was a sort of illicit reverse discrimination. He thought that it was reverse discrimination for federal law to say that African Americans, in fact all people, had to have the same rights to enter into contracts and own property on the same basis as white people. He viewed that as a type of, quote, affirmative action. Now, people nowadays don't view that as affirmative action. They view that as just anti-discrimination law. The affirmative action that we're used to, the affirmative action that I mainly talk about in my book, mainly came about in the late 1960s and the early 1970s. And the reason why it came about is because of a widespread feeling that anti-discrimination law alone would not be enough to quickly desegregate American life.
What about court cases?
There have been many court cases, and there will be many more. Just this past week, an anti-affirmative action organization filed a court case against my university, Harvard University, asserting that Harvard University was discriminating against Asian Americans in particular. There was a court case filed against the University of North Carolina claiming that their Asian Americans and whites were being discriminated against. So affirmative action, it's been controversial since the late 1960s. It remains controversial today.
What was the Bakke case?
The Bakke case was the first time that the Supreme Court of the United States fully grappled with affirmative action. And
early 70s?
It was the early 70s. In fact, it was 1975 or 1976, as I recall. And what happened in the Bakke case was it was a classic compromise. It was a case that involved affirmative action at the University of California at Davis Medical School. This medical school set aside a certain number of places, I think it was 16 places, for disadvantaged racial minorities. And what the Supreme Court said was that it was unconstitutional for a public institution of higher education to set aside a certain number of places. They said that is too quota-like, so they struck that down. But the Supreme Court also said that universities could take race into account along with other things in determining who they were going to admit to their to these educational institutions. By the way, that was a very interesting case because it really came down to just one justice. It was a split 4-4 case, and one justice, Lewis Powell, was the swing justice who said that you cannot have quotas, but you can take race into account as one of many factors. And by the way, that's the law of Bakke is still the reigning law of the Supreme Court. It might change, but Bakke still holds.
Do we have any idea what happened to Alan Bakke? I mean, what?
Yes, we do. Yes, we do. He went to medical school and he's become a doctor. And from what I can tell, he's led a gainful, productive life.
How frank can you be in discussions about race and the law with your students at Harvard?
I'm very frank. And in all of my books, I have attempted to be frank. I take my position. I take my position. I argue my position strongly. I am pro-affirmative action, for instance. But in my books, I also talk about the cost. I mean, and in fact, some of my friends get a little bit miffed with me because they think that maybe I give away too much. Maybe they think I talk about the cost too much. But I think people are smart. I think I don't think it's useful to try to hide the ball. I take a position. I believe that information is my friend. I want people to have information. I want people to have all the arguments. I think if people have all the arguments, they will, armed with all the arguments, embrace my position.